What if every moment you thought was an opportunity was actually another step toward ruin? Anne Boleyn was sent away as a child, fell in love only to lose it, and endured 7 years of waiting for a crown, only to lose everything in the end. Her story isn't one of failure, but of a fate that seemed written from the start. How did a young girl's life turn so bitterly tragic? Let's uncover the tragic thread. Anne Boleyn didn't have the kind of childhood anyone would envy. Imagine, for a moment, being sent away so young, not because you wanted to go or because an adventure awaited, but because someone else decided you'd been chosen for a life you couldn't even imagine yet. That was Anne, just a young girl, sent far from home because, to her family, her future was already set in motion, whether she liked it or not. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, wasn't just any ordinary man. He was an ambitious courtier, climbing his way into favour among the most powerful people in England. And for him, Anne wasn't just a daughter. She was a piece of his strategy, a way to push the Boleyn name higher into the ranks of nobility. So, at the age of 12 or possibly 13, Anne was sent to the Netherlands, to the court of Margaret of Austria, who ruled as regent for her nephew, Charles V, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Margaret's court was famous at the time for its sophistication. It was a world of intellectuals, artists, and rulers. But to a girl like Anne, who was barely a teenager, it must have felt impossibly far away from the green fields and familiar faces of her home. The purpose of this abrupt departure? To polish her. That's the word historians sometimes use, as though Anne herself were an unshaped stone, needing refinement to shine bright enough for the glittering world of European royalty. Under Marguerite's guidance, Anne was introduced to the finer aspects of education that would make her more appealing as a future lady at court. She studied music, needlework, and perhaps most critically, languages. It was here that Anne developed her sharp fluency in French, which later became one of her defining traits, setting her apart from many women in Henry VIII's court who couldn't so easily match her wit and elegance. Anne wasn't just being educated, though. She was being moulded. Marguerite, a powerful and deeply intelligent woman herself, offered an example of what a woman could achieve in a man's world. But at the same time, Anne's presence at her court was part of a system that saw young girls as tools for alliances, not individuals with desires of their own. Anne remained in the Netherlands for about a year. Then her time under Marguerite ended, and she was sent somewhere even further from home, the French court. France was a place of extraordinary culture at the time, but it was also a place bound by rules, subtle politics, and expectations. Anne became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, wife of Francis I. And while Queen Claude herself lived a reserved, pious life, the rest of the French court was a sharp contrast. It was full of scandal, flirtation, and art. If the Netherlands had refined Anne's mind, the French court gave her an education in navigating life's complexities, the kind of unspoken lessons you learn by observing how people interact, where alliances form, and how trust can easily fall apart. Imagine walking through those grand halls, a teenager from England, surrounded by whispers in a foreign language. Even though Anne had already picked up much of the French tongue and its rhythms, this wasn't home. Her family wasn't there to guide her. And yet, this formative time in France played a critical role in shaping her character. It wasn't just her intellect that grew sharper. It was her ability to mask her feelings, to calculate her words, and to carry herself with confidence even when she likely felt alone or unsure. Yet, those years abroad weren't just about adaptation. Anne stood out. She was said to have been lively, expressive, and remarkably charming, a mix of qualities that made people notice her, despite not being a typical beauty by the standards of her time. Where others aimed to please, Anne seemed to intrigue people through her boldness and individuality. The French court also introduced Anne to the kinds of women who lived with a measure of independence. Figures like Marguerite of Navarre, the king's sister, were intellectuals and reformers who didn't fit neatly into the expectations of what women were supposed to be. These women served as examples of strength, teaching Anne that there was power in wit and intelligence, even when wielded quietly. And though she grew, adapted, and rose within this foreign world, we can't forget one simple truth. None of this had been Anne's choice. She didn't select her path. She didn't decide to learn life's hardest lessons away from her family in the company of queens and courtiers. It had all been decided for her, arranged like a portrait, where she could pose beautifully, but never paint the scene herself. That's the thing about being polished. It assumes that the surface will shine, but not the person beneath. When Anne finally returned to England in 1522, she was no longer the girl who'd left. She was sophisticated, witty, and far more equipped to capture attention than nearly any other woman at Henry VIII's court. But the cost of that polish was clear. She had spent so much of her adolescence adapting to places, roles, and people that she barely had time to just exist as Anne. Everything she'd learned and endured abroad, her languages, education, and poise, were about one thing: preparing her to serve the ambitions of others. Her father, her family, all saw her as their ticket to power. They didn't see her as a person with her own yearnings. Even with that loneliness and disconnection, Anne's time abroad had armed her with the skills she'd need to eventually navigate the unpredictable world of Tudor politics. If she had stayed in England as a girl, perhaps her story would have been simpler. But that's the thing about potential. It rarely leaves room for simplicity. Her years at Marguerite of Austria's court, and later in France, were more than formative. They were the first chapters of a much longer story that Anne had little control over, but would be forced to live out in full. Her return to England might have seemed like a homecoming, but it wasn't the life Anne once knew. She didn't return to a quiet place among her family, but instead to a stage. Her family's ambitions now pointed straight toward the crown, and Anne was not going to have the freedom, even briefly, to choose a simpler life. Anything she might have gained abroad, knowledge, confidence, even the echoes of independence, would soon be eclipsed by what her family expected from her. So when Anne stepped off the ship as a young woman who had grown among the great courts of Europe, her future was already written by hands other than her own. These hands would guide her to love, heartbreak, and a throne she could never sit upon comfortably. For now, though, Anne was back in England, a polished gem ready to be presented to the world, not yet knowing what that world would take from her in return. Anne Boleyn didn't have the luxury of being seen as just herself. For the Boleyn family, she wasn't a daughter or a sister. She was an opportunity. Imagine coming home after years abroad, only to realize that every lesson, every carefully crafted skill you'd been taught, wasn't meant for your own benefit. It had all been part of a plan that wasn't even yours. That was the reality waiting for Anne. The Boleyns weren't a family content with staying in the background. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, had spent years maneuvering his way into the royal court, using his sharp wits and political instincts to secure positions of influence. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the daughter of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. From the start, Anne's lineage signaled ambition. The Boleyns weren't aristocrats simply looking for stability. They were climbers, and they had their sights set on the highest possible prize. For girls in noble families like Anne's, life wasn't lived for personal desires. Daughters, especially those with Anne's gifts, were seen as means to an end. Marriages weren't about love or companionship. They were chess moves, connections. And for the Boleyns, Anne wasn't just a pawn. She was their best piece on the board. She wasn't, like her sister Mary, used as a passing dalliance at court. Anne's intelligence and fiery personality made her suited for something far greater. But ambition comes with its own weight, and the pressure to meet those expectations rested squarely on Anne's shoulders. From the moment she returned to England, there was no room for missteps. Every word, gesture, and glance had to work toward the Boleyns' goals. And make no mistake, Anne wasn't simply being carried along in this plan. It was her talents that made her indispensable. By all accounts, Anne stood out in ways other women couldn't. She spoke French beautifully, carried herself with elegance, and had a sharp intellect that allowed her to engage in conversations most women of her age and status simply weren't part of. This wasn't by accident. Years abroad had molded her into exactly the kind of person who could navigate the world of court politics with ease. In other words, Anne wasn't being thrown into the royal court unprepared. She was the weapon her family had spent years polishing. But just because you're prepared doesn't mean you're free. That's the irony of Anne's position. The education and refinement that made her so valuable also robbed her of choice. She could outwit many of the courtiers surrounding her, but she couldn't escape the plans being laid for her by her family. At the heart of those plans, Henry VIII himself. It's hard to imagine now, with the way her story ends. But when Anne first stepped into Henry's court, she wasn't immediately in the center of his attention. In fact, it was her sister Mary who initially caught the king's wandering eye. Mary Boleyn entered into an affair with Henry, likely due to similar coercion from her family. But Mary's role was fleeting. While she held the king's affection for a time, it didn't lead to power or influence, at least not the long-term kind the Boleyns craved. It was Anne's entrance that marked a turning point. Anne wasn't like her sister. She didn't easily fall into the king's arms or simply accept her place as one of his many mistresses. Instead, she seemed to understand something others didn't. Henry VIII wasn't a man who responded to availability. He thrived on challenge. And in Anne, he found that challenge. She refused his advances, pushing him away in a way that must have felt both maddening and intoxicating. For Henry, who was used to women bending to his will, Anne was untouchable. And for the Boleyns, that untouchability was gold. But what made Anne resist? To hear some historians tell it, Anne was playing a calculated game, expertly maneuvering Henry into a position where he would offer her more than a fleeting affair. Others suggest that Anne genuinely didn't want to become his mistress because she understood it would lead to nothing but heartache and ruin. Either way, her refusal only increased Henry's interest, and it wasn't long before he became completely consumed by her. Letters he wrote to her are full of longing and desperation, making it clear that he saw Anne as the answer to something he'd been searching for. While Anne was occupying the king's thoughts, her family watched from the sidelines. Their ambitions seemed to take on a life of their own as Henry's affection grew. And here's the part that often gets overlooked: the immense pressure Anne must have felt from her own family. Their success, their position, everything rested on her shoulders. It wasn't just about winning the king's heart. It was about securing her family's future. How could love or happiness fit into a plan like that? Anne didn't get much room to act as a real person in all of this. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every choice limited by the expectations placed upon her. Her charm and intelligence weren't even wholly her own in the eyes of her family. They were tools, instruments to be used for the greater good of the Boleyn name. The weight of that must have been crushing, even if Anne rarely showed it. She presented herself as confident, playful, and poised. But deep down, she must have known her life wasn't fully her own, and those choices, or lack of them, started early. Before all the drama with Henry, there was another man. Henry Percy was a young nobleman, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, and it's believed that he and Anne fell deeply in love during her early years at court. They planned to marry. For a brief moment, Anne may have thought she had a chance at a life not dominated by ambition or politics, but that chance didn't last. The couple's romance was discovered, and Cardinal Wolsey, one of the most powerful men in England, stepped in to dissolve the engagement. Why? Percy's family likely didn't approve of the match. They felt Anne wasn't politically advantageous enough, and Anne's own family didn't fight for her. They had their sights set higher than the Earl of Northumberland. Anne and Percy's heartbreak wasn't just a personal loss. It was a reminder of how little control she had over her life. Love, happiness, freedom, all things most people long for, weren't even options for her. She was a tool, a means to an end. Her family didn't protect her from that reality. They leaned into it, actively positioning her at the center of the king's attention because it suited their aspirations. If Anne had any bitterness about losing Percy, or about the way her family treated her, it's something she rarely, if ever, let slip. She played her role well, perhaps too well. As Anne's star began to rise, it was clear that the Boleyn family's gamble was paying off. She wasn't Henry VIII's mistress. She was something more. The king wanted her as his wife, not a passing entertainment. It seemed like an achievement, a validation of all the sacrifices. But ambition is a dangerous thing. The very qualities that secured Anne's place at court, her wit, charm, and refusal to yield easily, would one day be the qualities used against her, and the ambitions that carried her to the center of power would eventually destroy her. For now, though, Anne played the part. She had no choice. Surrounded by a family who saw her as their greatest advantage, and a king determined to have her at all costs, Anne remained unwavering. But the cost of meeting their expectations had already been high. With Percy lost and Henry's pursuit intensifying, her life wasn't her own anymore, if it ever had been. Anne's rise wasn't entirely her victory. It was the product of careful, relentless planning by her family. They didn't see her as trapped. They saw her as fulfilling a destiny they'd written for her. And in a way, so did Anne. The heartbreak she endured, the sacrifices she made, none of it would be for nothing. Not yet, at least. But as much as Anne seemed to embrace her role, there was always one undeniable truth. When ambition drives you, it doesn't stop. Ambition doesn't rest. It doesn't allow for moments of peace or second chances. And for Anne, it wouldn't allow for love. Not even for a man like Henry Percy, who might have given her a far quieter, simpler fate. Instead, duty and strategy won out. And soon, Anne would find herself in the center of a much more dangerous game. What happens when love must bow to duty? For Anne Boleyn, that question became painfully real the moment Henry Percy walked into her life. Percy wasn't just another courtier in the bustling, glittering world of Tudor England. He was young, charming, and magnetic in a way that captured Anne's full attention, and she captured his. The two seemed to fit together effortlessly, their connection built on more than just intrigue or fleeting admiration. This wasn't political strategy, and it wasn't an arrangement created to serve someone else's agenda. For once, it felt real. Percy, the heir to the Earl of Northumberland, was one of the most eligible bachelors in the kingdom. With his noble title and promising future, he was a catch by any standard. But for Anne, he was far more. He didn't see her as a pawn or a polished product of years abroad. He saw her for who she was, or at least the person she tried to be, beneath all the layers of expectation. They grew close during their time at court, and it wasn't long before the whisper of an engagement followed. Imagine Anne in that moment, a young woman whose life had never been her own, thinking for the first time that love could outshine duty. Of course, the world of Tudor politics had no patience for such romantic notions. Anne could dream quietly of a future with Percy, perhaps filled with something resembling happiness. But that dream collided hard with the ambitions circling around her. The idea of marrying for love didn't just seem naive to the powerful figures in her life. It seemed dangerous. Cardinal Wolsey, one of the most influential men in England and a hand of the king, stepped in decisively to put an end to the match. Why? Because Percy's future had already been written by others. His father, the Earl of Northumberland, had no intention of seeing his son marry someone like Anne, someone whose family, while noble, didn't carry the level of power or wealth they desired. But it wasn't just Percy's family. Anne's own father might have quietly allowed things to unfold, but only if it didn't interfere with his greater plans. Thomas Boleyn had no interest in letting his daughter forge her own path. Anne, by this point, was too valuable to the family's political ambitions to be tied down in what was, to him, a trivial romance. To make matters worse, Wolsey's intervention wasn't subtle. The moment he got word of the relationship, he summoned Percy and scolded him, personally ensuring that the engagement went no further. Percy's father supported Wolsey completely, and just like that, Anne's future with Percy unraveled. Anne wasn't the kind of woman to simply shrug and move on. There's evidence that Wolsey's interference enraged her, perhaps not only because it ended her relationship, but because it reminded her, once again, of how little control she had over her own life. She was completely vulnerable to the ambitions and decisions of others, even when it came to the most intimate parts of her life. Percy, bound by duty, obeyed Wolsey's orders, and the engagement was over before it could begin in earnest. The fallout left Anne heartbroken and humiliated, a wound that wouldn't fully heal, even as she rose to unprecedented heights in the years that followed. Think about how that moment shaped Anne. Before Percy, she might have held on to some belief that love and personal happiness could factor into her future. But losing him, and losing him in such a brutal political way, must have cemented a truth she'd likely suspected for years. Love was something she couldn't afford. That loss didn't just scar her, it hardened her. The Anne who emerged from this heartbreak wasn't meek or defeated. She didn't resign herself to being a passive piece in someone else's game. Instead, she became sharper, smarter. If she couldn't have love, then she wouldn't bend her will for anything less than power. As for Percy, his life seemingly moved on. He would go on to fulfill the marriage his family had planned for him, though by all accounts it was a miserable union. Years later, When Anne was at the height of her power as queen, Percy's name briefly resurfaced. During her downfall, rumours swirled that Percy might have been romantically involved with Anne, even suggesting that he was the father of her child. Although these claims were unfounded and likely part of the conspiracy to end Anne's reign, they reflected the lingering connection people still associated between them. And for Percy, this connection remained a shadow over his life, tied to feelings he may never have fully buried. When he refused to testify against Anne during her trial, it was perhaps the only bit of defiance he allowed himself in their shared story. But for Anne, Percy wasn't just the man she lost. He became, unintentionally, a symbol of everything she wasn't allowed to have. His absence forced her to recalibrate what mattered to her and how far she was willing to let herself hope for anything resembling freedom. After Percy, Anne approached life with the clarity of someone who had seen their path rewritten and refused to be undone by it. She wouldn't pine for romance or let herself be derailed by heartache. If she couldn't have freedom in love, then she'd chase the only other kind of freedom she could imagine, one that lay in power and influence. It was as if Percy's departure closed one door forever in Anne's life while forcing another one wide open, leading her down a path she wouldn't turn away from, no matter how treacherous it became. Historians often describe this moment as a crucial turning point in Anne's life, not just personally, but strategically. The heartbreak set her priorities, not because she chose to let it define her, but because she didn't have a choice. Love, after all, was a luxury denied to women like Anne. The end of her relationship with Percy wasn't just the loss of a man she cared about. It was the loss of a future where her happiness might have mattered. From that point on, Anne would defend herself fiercely. She wouldn't allow others to dictate every aspect of her life again, not without a fight. It's no coincidence that after Percy, Anne's sharpness, ambition, and perhaps guardedness became so central to her character. And yet, it would be simplistic to say that Anne stopped believing in love entirely. Her later relationship with Henry VIII, complicated as it was, did stem from genuine passion, at least in its earlier stages. But the naive, unguarded love she gave Percy, that part of Anne, the one who dreamed of happiness apart from duty, was gone. In its place stood a woman determined to carve something meaningful for herself, even if it meant stepping into dangerous, uncharted territory, even if it meant risking everything. Anne's heartbreak with Percy wasn't a dramatic, earth-shattering blow in the history of Tudor England. To those around her, it might have seemed like just another casualty of court politics. But for Anne, it was deeply personal. It reshaped her outlook, hardening her in ways that prepared her for the ruthless world she would face. In losing Percy, she lost more than love. She lost the version of herself that might have hoped for a simpler life. And in its place, ambition grew. Not the blind ambition of her family, but something far more complex. A determination to take control of the narrative others had tried to write for her. It's tempting to wonder how Anne's life might have turned out if Wolsey hadn't interfered, if Percy's father hadn't objected, if love had been allowed to win over duty. But in Tudor England, the concept of what if didn't hold much weight. There was no place for daydreams, not when ambition and strategy trumped everything else. And for Anne, that harsh reality became the foundation for the rest of her life. If love was impossible, then ambition would have to suffice. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was all she had left. Anne's story is often told from the perspective of her later years, her rise as Henry VIII's obsession, her triumph as queen, and her devastating fall. But moments like this one, losing Percy, aren't just footnotes in her life. They're the quiet, human tragedies that made her who she was. Without him, Anne became the Anne we know today. Fiercely intelligent, unapologetically ambitious, and willing to face whatever came next. Percy might have been her first heartbreak, but he wouldn't be her last. This was only the beginning. Imagine spending nearly 7 years positioned at the crossroads of ambition and disdain, trapped by forces larger than yourself, and yet still trying to hold your head high. For Anne Boleyn, this was her life during the most critical years leading up to her marriage to Henry VIII. Those 7 years were not marked by joy or ease. They were defined by waiting. Waiting for a promise that always seemed just out of reach. Waiting while the eyes of an entire nation turned on her, filled with vitriol. And while she waited, the storms of political and religious upheaval swirled all around her, leaving her caught in the center of it all. Anne's story with Henry didn't start like some fairy tale, the way romanticized accounts might suggest. By the time Anne came into the king's life, Henry VIII was already deep into his dissatisfaction with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, the daughter of the formidable Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, had been married to Henry for years. She was everything a queen was expected to be: dignified, devoted, and politically advantageous, at least at first. But what she wasn't, no matter how desperately Henry wished otherwise, was the mother of a surviving male heir. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary Tudor. And for Henry, that wasn't enough. A daughter didn't secure the Tudor dynasty. What Henry wanted, what he believed he was owed, was a son. And this failure, as he framed it, didn't fall on him. It fell on Catherine. Enter Anne. By the time Henry began to fix his eyes on her around 1526, she'd already made a name for herself at court. Her intelligence, wit, and striking presence had made her impossible to ignore. But Anne wasn't like her sister Mary, who had been one of Henry's earlier mistresses. Anne didn't play the meek, pliable role Henry might have expected. She didn't surrender to his advances. Instead, she stood apart, making herself unreachable, and that only fueled Henry's obsession. Anne knew this game, or at least she thought she did. By holding Henry at arm's length, she became a prize he couldn't resist chasing. But Anne wasn't just playing hard to get for the sake of her pride. If she had agreed to become Henry's mistress, her future would have looked much like Mary's. A brief stint as the king's favorite, followed by a quiet dismissal into obscurity. Anne wanted more, or perhaps more accurately, she understood that she had to want more. Her family's ambitions had placed her in this position, and she couldn't afford to squander it. If she was going to risk everything, her reputation, her security, her future, it wouldn't be for a fleeting affair. It would be for the crown. Henry, of course, took the bait. He promised Anne that he would make her his queen. He wrote her letters filled with yearning, professing his desire to give her everything she could ever want. But there was one very large obstacle standing in the way of that promise: his marriage to Catherine. Divorcing a queen wasn't as simple as filing paperwork and moving on. Henry's marriage to Catherine wasn't just a personal vow. It was a political and religious bond. Breaking it required a level of upheaval that would shake England to its core. For nearly 7 years, Anne waited as Henry pursued what became infamously known as the King's Great Matter. He petitioned the Pope, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the very start because she had previously been married to his older brother Arthur. According to Henry, this violated a passage from Leviticus, which claimed that a man should not marry his brother's wife. Catherine, of course, fiercely denied this interpretation. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that her union with Henry was both legitimate and sanctified by God. The Pope, unwilling to alienate Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment Henry needed. And so, the years dragged on. While Henry fought to untangle himself from Catherine, Anne was forced to endure the judgment of an increasingly hostile public. She became the face of Henry's desire to dismantle a queen beloved by many. To the common people, Anne was no rightful bride meant to take her place on the throne. She was the other woman, a temptress, a homewrecker. It didn't help that Anne wasn't the demure, reserved image of what a queen was supposed to be. She was opinionated, outspoken, and unapologetic about her presence at court. For that, she wasn't just scorned, she was hated. The rumors surrounding Anne only added fuel to the fire. Pamphlets and songs accused her of everything from witchcraft to seduction, painting her as a manipulative figure who had ensnared the king through unnatural means. And then there were the whispers about her appearance. Some said she had extra fingers or a strange mole that marked her as a servant of the devil. Cruel exaggerations that tied into the already simmering fears about her. The public's hostility didn't seem to shake Henry's determination. If anything, it seemed to solidify his resolve. For him, Anne wasn't just a woman he desired. She was the embodiment of the fresh start he craved. But for Anne, that hatred must have been suffocating. Everywhere she turned, she was reminded that she wasn't loved, that her presence at Henry's side was seen as an affront to tradition, morality, and even God. And yet, Anne stayed. She didn't waver, at least not outwardly. It's easy to look back now, knowing the ending of her story, and say that she should have walked away when she had the chance. But where could she have gone? Returning to life as an unmarried woman in 16th century England wasn't a viable option. Her reputation was already tied so closely to Henry that any attempt to step back would have left her vulnerable and powerless. She had already invested years of her life into the pursuit of the crown. Walking away at this point wasn't just unthinkable, it was impossible. During these grueling years, Anne didn't sit idly by as the world judged her. She was actively involved in the politics surrounding the annulment, often acting as Henry's confidant and supporter as he worked to separate himself from Catherine. Anne even played a role in pushing for reform within the English Church, aligning herself with figures who sought to challenge the authority of the Pope. This wasn't just about her marriage to Henry. It was about reshaping the very structures of power that governed England. But reforming the Church wasn't a simple task. It required a radical break with tradition and a willingness to bear the consequences of that break. And Anne, alongside Henry, was willing to take that risk. By 1533, Henry finally took matters into his own hands. Frustrated with the Pope's refusal to grant the annulment, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively separating England from the authority of Rome. With this newfound power, Henry dissolved his marriage to Catherine and secretly wed Anne. She was crowned queen in a grand ceremony, marking what should have been the culmination of everything she and Henry had worked toward. But even as she ascended the throne, the hatred she faced didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger. Catherine's supporters didn't simply vanish. They remained, quietly or openly opposing Anne's place in the world. The crown Anne had waited 7 years for came at a cost few people would have been willing to bear. she had endured public scorn, personal sacrifice, and the constant uncertainty of whether Henry's promises would ever become reality. Those 7 years were marked by humiliation as much as they were by ambition, and they set the stage for the pressures that would soon follow. Because now that Anne was queen, the expectations placed upon her weren't just heavy, they were crushing. The truth is, the years Anne spent waiting didn't lead to a reward. They only opened the door to a new set of impossible demands, pushing her further down a path shaped by forces she could never control. What came next was the real test. A fight to hold onto a crown that had already cost her so much. Imagine climbing the summit of everything you'd ever worked for, only to find that the air there is unbearably thin. Anne Boleyn had become queen, but the golden crown she fought for quickly became a weight she could scarcely carry. From the moment the coronation festivities ended, her life as Henry VIII's wife was consumed by one thing: producing a male heir. That was what Henry demanded. It was what the court expected. It was what Anne's very survival as queen depended on. But nature, cruelly indifferent to courtly demands, had other plans. Anne's first pregnancy seemed to promise everything both she and Henry needed. In September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. It should have been a joyous moment, and for a time, it likely was. But a girl, no matter how healthy or promising, wasn't the result Henry had prayed for. From day one, Elizabeth's birth was a disappointment, not to Anne as a mother, of course, but to the king, who had long convinced himself that Anne, unlike Catherine, would deliver him the long-desired son. It's hard to imagine how Anne must have felt in those early moments. On one hand, she'd given birth to a future queen, though she probably didn't know it at the time. On the other, she knew better than anyone how narrowly a queen's worth was measured. For Henry, Elizabeth wasn't enough. His affections, once so consuming they led him to break with the entire Roman Catholic Church, became noticeably cooler when the baby swaddled in silk wasn't the boy he'd spent years justifying their marriage for. Anne, despite her sharp wit and political cunning, had entered into a role that came with impossibly high stakes. Motherhood wasn't just a personal milestone. It was her duty to the crown, and if she failed, it wouldn't be Henry's fault. Not in his eyes, at least. It would be hers. The court was watching. Anne's position, precarious from the moment she married Henry, became even more so in the years that followed Elizabeth's birth. Every time Anne carried another pregnancy, the hopes and the pressure mounted. Her critics, of which there were many, weren't shy about voicing their discontent. This wasn't a compassionate age. Miscarriages, stillbirths, or even moments of difficulty in conception were seen as failings of the woman, not as a quirk of biology beyond anyone's control. Anne would try to meet these expectations repeatedly, and each time she didn't produce a living son, the whispers around her grew louder. It's worth pausing to understand the toll of that kind of constant judgment. Miscarriage is, on its own, a devastating loss. But for Anne, it wasn't just personal grief. It was public failure. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. And most painfully of all, Henry saw too. Anne's second pregnancy appears to have ended in miscarriage as well, though records from the time vary. What's certain is that by 1534, she had not provided the male heir she so desperately needed to secure her future. The strain on their marriage began to show. Remember, this was the same Henry who once flooded Anne with love letters, filled with everything from eloquent promises to surprisingly clumsy yearning. The same Henry who had broken his marriage to Catherine, faced a nation's rejection and created an entirely new church just to be with her. And yet, with every failed pregnancy, Anne became less of the radiant object of his obsession and more of an inconvenient problem. Henry's drift from fiery passion to cold indifference didn't happen overnight, but it was impossible for Anne to ignore. Days that may have once been filled with affection, or at least attention, turned into something far lonelier. By early 1536, it seemed the situation had turned tragically irreversible. Anne suffered what may have been her third miscarriage, but it wasn't just any miscarriage. Reports suggest that she lost a male child, a son. The boy who could have silenced her critics rekindled Henry's affection and solidified her place as queen. Losing that pregnancy wasn't just a personal heartbreak. It marked the moment Henry appeared to fully turn away from her. Tudor historians often highlight this tragic loss as the pivot point in Anne's fate. She had always faced enemies, but now her strongest ally, her husband, had started looking elsewhere. Henry didn't just stop loving Anne. He began to reconsider her place in his world entirely. By this point, Henry's attentions had already begun wandering toward Jane Seymour, a quiet and seemingly docile alternative to Anne's fiery and outspoken personality. Anne's confidence, once something Henry had admired, now grated on him in the face of her perceived failures. And Jane was everything Anne wasn't: soft-spoken, malleable, and, crucially, untainted by the bitterness of public scandal. The court, ever attuned to its king's preferences, began to shift around Jane, leaving Anne increasingly isolated. But Anne wasn't blind to the change in Henry. She was deeply aware of how fragile her position had become. She likely tried to hold her ground, though her options were formidable in their limits. Surrounded by figures whispering in Henry's ear, her own court had become treacherous. Her miscarriages had provided ammunition not only to her enemies, but to Henry himself. Henry, ever the pragmatist when his own image or dynasty was at stake, began embracing an insidious narrative that Anne's failure to produce a son was more than poor fortune. Perhaps he started to believe, or at least allowed himself to consider, it was destiny, a divine punishment. After all, hadn't he risked everything to marry her? Hadn't he stood against the Pope, defied tradition, and endured years of resistance from his own nation for the promise that Anne would be the answer to his problems? If that promise was broken, where did the blame lie? Anne, as queen, wasn't afforded the luxury of sharing in Henry's doubts. They weren't his alone. They were hers to shoulder. And she did, but at great personal cost. The woman who had entered the court with sharp ambition and charm now found herself increasingly alone. The miscarriages drained her physically, emotionally, and politically. Her supporters at court had thinned, replaced, or silenced by those hoping to align themselves with Jane Seymour and the faction rising around her. What makes Anne's story so heartbreaking here isn't just the losses she endured. It's the inhumane expectations placed on her. The stakes were insurmountable, and the consequences of failure were inescapable. No queen could have lived up to what was demanded of Anne. Yet history treated it as if she fell short by her own doing. Even now, there's a cruel irony in how Anne's life is remembered. People see her as ambitious, cunning, or even ruthless. Traits historians often ascribe to her without accounting for the simple truth that the world she was born into left her with so few choices. Anne didn't choose to be defined by her ability to produce her heir. That role was forced on her. In the end, Anne's pain wasn't just the physical toll of her lost pregnancies or the emotional devastation of losing Henry's affection. It was the isolation of knowing she couldn't meet an expectation no human could guarantee. And it was realizing, too late, that Henry's love had a condition no love should ever have: success. Without a son, there was no place for Anne in Henry's world, none at all. By the time Anne lost her final pregnancy, the cracks in her position had spread far enough for her enemies to exploit them. Henry, who had once defied empires to be with her, was now openly indifferent, his focus shifting toward Jane Seymour and the promises her quiet nature seemed to carry. For Anne, her crown had become a curse. It wasn't a symbol of triumph. It was a constant reminder of the expectations she hadn't fulfilled, and in Henry's eyes, wouldn't. The stage was set for what came next. The once beloved queen was now little more than an obstacle, a queen without a son, and soon a queen without allies. Henry's coldness had become more than an emotional gulf. It was a warning, one that Anne surely understood, even if she wasn't ready to admit where the shifting tides would soon lead. Imagine waking up every day in lavish surroundings, surrounded by the hum of courtiers, the clatter of footsteps on marble floors, the rustle of silk gowns. Now, imagine that behind those smiles and curtsies, every pair of eyes is watching, judging, and waiting for you to fail. That was Anne Boleyn's reality in her final years as queen. Her life at court, once a theatre for her charm and ambition, had turned into something dark. The grand halls of Henry VIII's court were no longer a stage where she could shine, but a labyrinth filled with whispers, rumours, and betrayal. Anne's reign as queen had never been welcomed by everyone. From the moment she stepped into Catherine of Aragon's shoes, many at court regarded her as an outsider, a usurper. But initially, she had allies, her family, her supporters, even Henry himself. That sense of security, however fragile, had long since begun to erode. By 1536, Anne's circle had shrunk considerably, her once passionate husband increasingly distant, her court filled with those who had little love for her and plenty of reasons to undermine her. Henry's growing fascination with Jane Seymour brought Anne's vulnerability into sharp focus. Jane wasn't loud. She wasn't opinionated. She wasn't Anne. To Henry, who had long tired of Anne's fiery temperament and ability to challenge him, Jane represented something easier, simpler. And it didn't take long for court gossip to centre on this latest shift in Henry's gaze. Jane's quiet demeanour belied her ambition. No one openly encouraged a king's affection without understanding what was at stake. While Anne had risen by standing apart and playing a careful, calculated game, Jane played her cards with subtlety. She folded notes from the king neatly into the bodice of her gown, ensuring Anne would hear of it somehow. Wouldn't you? It was impossible for Anne not to notice Henry's growing preference for someone else, a rejection not just of her, but of the very qualities that had elevated her to the throne. But there was something darker happening beyond Henry's wandering affections. Power struggles at court had always been ruthless, and Anne found herself at the centre of them. Her success, her ability to rise so high so quickly, made her many enemies. Where some might have been awed by her wit and determination, others resented her for the same reasons. A woman like Anne, who dared to exist boldly in a man's world, drew criticism for her ambition and made herself a target for schemes. Men like Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and once a staunch ally, saw opportunity in Anne's increasingly precarious position. Cromwell wasn't her enemy at first. In a way, they'd worked together. both instrumental in the enormous shifts in England's religious and political foundation. But their collaboration didn't mean loyalty. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, knew the winds of favour were shifting. He could see that Anne's influence over the king had waned, and like many in Henry's court, he understood exactly what that meant. Her weakness could be his gain. Court life became suffocating for Anne. Every move she made, every word she uttered was monitored, dissected, and twisted. Spies didn't need to skulk in the shadows. Often, her own ladies-in-waiting acted as informants, feeding tidbits of gossip to those eager to see her fall. These women weren't merely companions. They were embedded in her life, privy to her private moments, and some, but not all, likely resented the queen they were forced to serve, a queen they believed didn't belong. It's said that Anne's fiery temper didn't endear her to many of these women, whose loyalty to her was either tepid at best or non-existent. But Anne wasn't blind to the tension surrounding her. She knew her position was slipping. Henry's growing coldness, Jane's quiet but persistent pursuit of the king's favour, and the swirling resentment of the court made Anne's once commanding air seem brittle, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. She must have felt more and more like a queen in name only. Still, she clung to her role, giving no outward sign of breaking. For Anne, showing vulnerability wasn't an option. Fighting, however quietly or subtly, was in her very nature. But the murmurs of her enemies only grew louder. Cromwell, who had now positioned himself against Anne in the court's shadowy power play, began laying the groundwork for her complete undoing. At that time, rumours were enough to ruin a person's life, especially in a court like Henry's, where paranoia was as plentiful as gold leaf on the walls. Although Cromwell's ultimate strategy would come later, Anne was already dealing with an environment thick with suspicion and deceit. Perhaps unsurprisingly, allegations and rumours weren't always about strategy. They didn't need to be logical or plausible to do damage. For instance, there were already rumours of Anne's supposed unnatural powers, whispers that she had bewitched Henry into forsaking Catherine. Wouldn't those whispers seem louder now, as her charm seemed to fade and Henry's gaze turned toward someone new? Then there were the rumours of her cruelty, her sharp words cutting through courtly politeness with a speed that shocked and offended people used to women's quiet compliance. Even small moments of wit or frustration could be magnified into evidence of her unsuitability as queen. She wasn't just criticized for what she failed to achieve, a male heir, but for the very qualities that had once won Henry over. It seemed there was no move Anne could make that wasn't interpreted in the least favourable light. And through all of it, Anne lived under constant observation. It was a court where walls had ears, where alliances shifted as rapidly as the weather. Trusted friends could be coerced into betrayal through bribery, threats, or promises of greater favour with the king. People you once thought loyal began disappearing from your side, until the faces surrounding you seemed less like companions and more like threats cloaked in jewels and silk. Anne couldn't avoid Jane Seymour's growing presence at court. Henry's infatuation with her wasn't just personal. It was a public slight against the Queen, one that everyone noticed. Jane's family, always alive to the opportunities presented by a monarch's interest, began rising in prominence as Anne's allies fell away. For Anne, every passing day marked another step toward isolation, her influence dwindling while Jane's grew. Knowing this, Anne must have understood what was truly at stake. Losing Henry's affection was never just romantic heartbreak. For a queen, it spelled the beginning of the end. This was the final twist of Anne Boleyn's time at court. What had once been a palace gilded with potential and opportunity now felt dark, heavy with the knowledge that she could trust no one. Survival in Henry's court had always required political skill and charm, but for Anne, her weaponry was now dulled, her allies gone, and her position surrounded on all sides by hostility. This court, which had once elevated her so high, now waited hungrily for her to fall. Anne's growing isolation didn't just foreshadow her eventual downfall, it actively contributed to it. The more her enemies whispered and schemed, the more they fed into Henry's growing disillusionment with her. Anne's miscarriages and Henry's erratic, self-absorbed personality made her easy to scapegoat. And in a setting where truth mattered far less than perception, Anne's fall was increasingly a question of when, not if. For Anne, those final months must have felt impossible to escape. She could see the walls closing in around her, but there was no door to flee through, no ally powerful enough to pull her to safety. Henry's court was now her prison, a place where every interaction felt heavy with unsaid meaning, and every gesture from Henry was colder than the last. Anne's final days as queen weren't marked by grand displays or fiery confrontations. They were filled with something much quieter, a gnawing, inescapable realization that the life she had fought for was crumbling and that she was powerless to stop it. And when the accusations began to surface, charges of adultery, treason, even incest, it was no great surprise to Anne. She had been surrounded by enemies for too long to believe they wouldn't eventually find a way to strike. But the scale and brutality of what came next, no amount of court cunning could have prepared her for that. Imagine this. You're standing in the center of the most powerful court in England. The jeweled walls and tapestries surrounding you might as well be made of stone, because no matter how much you speak to defend yourself, no one is really listening. The accusations piling up aren't just ludicrous, they're monstrous. Adultery, incest, high treason, crimes that, if proven, would not only cost you your crown, but your life. For Anne Boleyn, this wasn't some nightmare to be woken up from. It was her reality. The charges came quickly, almost suddenly, though they had been long in the making. By May 1536, Anne's position at court was already teetering on the edge. Henry VIII, the king who had once rewritten the rules of church and state for her, had turned cold, his gaze fixed elsewhere, on Jane Seymour and on the possibility of a third marriage. But coldness wasn't enough to remove a queen. To pull a woman like Anne from her throne required something bigger. It required scandal. And that's exactly what Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, set out to create. Cromwell had been one of Anne's closest allies during her rise to power, a man who had helped orchestrate Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and worked to push through the sweeping reforms of the English Reformation. But allies in Henry VIII's court rarely stayed allies for long when ambition or power shifted their direction. Anne and Cromwell had fallen out over a number of issues, particularly their opposing political priorities. Anne supported reformist causes and had championed individuals Cromwell sought to sideline. Worse, Anne was sharp and outspoken, a combination that had made her a valuable partner once, but now painted her as a threat. Cromwell's survival depended on keeping the king happy, and Anne's increasingly precarious position made her an ideal target. The accusations against Anne were carefully designed to tear apart her image as queen and to justify her removal, even in a court hungry for scandal. Adultery was one thing. It was damaging enough on its own, especially for a queen whose position revolved entirely around the sanctity of her marriage. But Cromwell and his conspirators didn't stop there. They accused her not only of adultery, but also of committing the crime with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charge of incest turned Anne's life into a dark spectacle, something that horrified even her detractors. It was as if Cromwell understood that society needed something unthinkable to truly tip the scales against Anne. And if incest wasn't enough, they added treason to the mix. Allegedly, in her lustful conspiracies, Anne had plotted against the king himself, endangering not just the marriage, but the entire Tudor state. If any of this sounds far-fetched, that's because it was. The evidence supporting these claims was flimsy at best, non-existent at worst. Witness testimonies were coerced, dates didn't align, and the stories spun by the prosecution fell apart under even light scrutiny. But in Henry's court, truth mattered far less than perception. The goal wasn't to prove Anne's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It was to establish the appearance of guilt so convincingly that no one would question the king's decision to remove her. Among the men accused alongside Anne were courtiers with whom she had been close, including her brother George, her musician Mark Smeaton, and other members of her trusted inner circle. By naming these men, the accusers played into the narrative that Anne's relationships, no matter how innocent, were suspect. Mark Smeaton, a man of lowly status compared to the others, was the only one to confess to adultery with Anne. But that confession was almost certainly extracted under torture, a detail many at court would have silently understood, but dared not acknowledge. It's almost unthinkable now. The mere word of a confession made under duress was enough to turn suspicion into damning proof. For Anne, the fallout of these accusations was more than humiliation. By Tudor standards, she had been reduced to nothing. Her integrity, her virtue, her very humanity thrown into question. There's little doubt she understood how dire her situation was. Surrounded by court dealings that grew colder by the day, she had to watch as former allies distanced themselves, as the men accused alongside her were hauled to trial, and as Henry himself turned away completely. The speed at which the accusations spread wasn't coincidental. Cromwell had every intention of ensuring Anne's downfall unfolded quickly enough to prevent her from mounting any effective defense. Once the allegations surfaced, there wasn't time for reason to intervene. Here's how it played out. Anne was arrested on May 2nd, 1536, escorted to the Tower of London by barge. The journey itself would have been an unforgettable moment, a symbolic stripping away of everything she had achieved. As Anne passed beneath the Traitor's Gate, she knew what awaited her. The day of her arrest, Anne reportedly protested her innocence with a calm resolve. "I am the king's true and lawful wife," she is said to have declared. But in a court where whispers carried more weight than evidence, her protests fell on deaf ears. Inside the tower, she continued to assert that the charges were baseless. Yet even her sharp mind couldn't untangle the web of lies being spun around her. Every visit from guards, every summons, every hint of movement in the tower likely brought fresh dread. There was no justice system in the sense we think of today. There was power, and that power belonged entirely to Henry and Cromwell. But the question remains, why these accusations? Why incest of all things? Why adultery on such an exaggerated scale? The answer lies in control. By accusing Anne of the unthinkable, Cromwell and Henry ensured that no one would sympathize with her. The public, already uneasy with Anne's rise, needed little convincing to brand her as wicked. The sheer viciousness of the charges erased any possibility of redemption or doubt. And for Henry, the accusations served another purpose. They turned Anne's downfall not into a personal betrayal, but a national necessity. Removing her wasn't just a matter of his own desires. It was, in his view, an act of justice for the country. And yet, the hypocrisy couldn't have been clearer. Henry, who had been unfaithful to Anne repeatedly, who had indulged his own desires without question or consequence, sat in judgment of her alleged impropriety. Meanwhile, Cromwell orchestrated every move, ensuring that the process was swift and airtight enough to please the increasingly impatient king. Henry wanted Anne gone, and Cromwell delivered. Each day in the Tower must have felt longer than the last for Anne. Knowing her fate was decided, knowing her enemies had already won, what could she do? Even as she prepared for the trial ahead, it must have been clear to her that the outcome was predetermined. The humiliation wasn't confined to the walls of the Tower either. Outside, the court and country buzzed with scandal. Anne, once positioned as the radiant queen who had captured Henry's heart, was now labelled a monster. A woman so depraved, they said, even her own family wasn't safe from her. By framing Anne's fall as not just personal but treasonous, Cromwell and Henry succeeded in framing her removal as a necessary act for the stability of the realm. These weren't just crimes of passion or betrayal. They were painted as offences against God, the monarchy, and England itself. And what's most tragic is how little Anne could do to fight back. The systems that had elevated her were now crushing her, and she had no tools left to protect herself. Looking back, it's impossible to separate the lies from the power grabs. Anne wasn't destroyed because she was guilty. She was destroyed because it was convenient. She had served her purpose, and when that purpose was no longer needed, when she failed to provide a male heir, when her presence became too divisive, she was discarded. The accusations against her weren't about justice, nor were they about morality. They were about clearing a path for Henry's next move, whatever that might be. And as those lies churned in the shadows of the court, Anne waited. Soon the trial would come, though it was hardly a trial in the sense of fairness or truth. It was theatre, staged for a court and country that had already made up its mind long before she set foot in the Tower. Anne Boleyn's trial wasn't a trial at all. It may have taken place in a courtroom, with all the pomp and procedure you'd expect in Tudor England. But when it came to justice, there was none to be found. From the moment the charges were brought against her, Anne's fate had already been decided. What unfolded on May 15th, 1536, wasn't about determining innocence or guilt. It was a performance, a grim spectacle designed to legitimize what everyone in that courtroom already knew. Anne would never leave the Tower alive. The trial took place in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, a fittingly foreboding location for what was about to happen. It wasn't just an ordinary court, but a grand gathering of England's most powerful men. Sitting as Anne's judge was none other than her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Howard, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, presided over a jury filled with noblemen handpicked to guarantee the correct outcome. These weren't impartial jurors weighing the evidence carefully. Many were personal enemies of Anne, men who had long resented her rise to power and now saw an opportunity to erase her from the political landscape. Anne's arrival in the courtroom was a stark reminder of all that she had lost. Dressed in her finery as Queen of England, she carried herself with dignity, even as she faced the assembled crowd. But her composure couldn't hide the reality of her situation. This was no longer her court. Every pair of eyes in that hall belonged to someone who had already turned against her, or worse, never supported her at all. The audience wasn't there to listen. They were there to see the once mighty queen humbled. The charges Anne faced were staggering. Adultery alone would have been enough to destroy her, but the accusations piled higher. 5 counts of adultery, 1 charge of committing incest with her brother George, and conspiracy against the king himself. According to her accusers, Anne had not only betrayed Henry with multiple men, but had plotted his death. This wasn't just an attack on her character. It was a declaration that Anne Boleyn was an active danger to the realm. But the accusations didn't hold up under scrutiny, not that anyone expected them to. The evidence presented in court was flimsy at best and outright absurd at worst. Dates of Anne's supposed affairs didn't align with the Queen's whereabouts. Some even placed her in entirely different locations. Witnesses offered inconsistent, contradictory testimony, none of which stood up to basic logic. And yet, this wasn't a trial about facts or reasonable doubt. It was about constructing a narrative strong enough to justify Anne's execution, regardless of its truth. One of the most damning pieces of testimony came from Mark Smeaton, a court musician accused of being one of Anne's lovers. Smeaton confessed to the affair, but the circumstances surrounding his confession tell a grim story of coercion and desperation. Unlike the other men accused alongside Anne, Smeaton was a commoner without the protections of nobility. It's widely believed he was tortured, if not physically, then through psychological torment, to produce the words his interrogators demanded. His confession, though likely fabricated, was enough to ruin Anne in the eyes of those who sought her downfall. After all, if one man admitted to such an affair, it became easier to believe the others might have been guilty too. Anne, for her part, didn't take the accusations quietly. Throughout the trial, she maintained her innocence with a composure that astonished even her detractors. She was eloquent, addressing the charges with a sharp intellect that had once captivated Henry himself. She denied every allegation, rebutting claims of adultery and treason with clarity and force. To the incest charge, she expressed horror, casting the very suggestion as both vile and absurd. But Anne's words, no matter how measured or persuasive, were lost on the court. The verdict wasn't hers to influence. It had been written long before she entered the hall. Anne wasn't just defending herself in that courtroom. She was defending her legacy, her daughter, and the very idea that a queen could be more than a pawn in the hands of men. Perhaps some part of her knew this was a losing battle. She had seen how quickly Henry's affections had turned against her, how little her past loyalty or achievements mattered now that she was no longer useful. But even in the face of the inevitable, Anne refused to crumble. If they were going to destroy her, she wouldn't make it easy. Of course, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. How could they not? Their positions, their wealth, even their lives depended on keeping Henry VIII satisfied. To acquit Anne would have been an act of rebellion against the king himself, a risk no nobleman in Tudor England was willing to take. When Norfolk announced the verdict, he made a point of emphasizing Anne's so-called crimes against her husband and her country. The sentence was death, either by burning or beheading, at the king's discretion. It was a statement meant to erase her entirely, both as a person and as a symbol of what she had once represented. The trial wasn't just about Anne's guilt or innocence. It was part of a broader strategy by Cromwell and Henry to dismantle the Boleyn faction entirely. Her brother George was tried immediately after Anne, facing the same baseless accusations of adultery and treason. He too was convicted, condemned not by facts, but by the need to consolidate power. By the time the trials concluded, the Boleyn family had been shattered, their influence reduced to ashes. What made Anne's trial particularly tragic was the sheer cruelty of the process. It wasn't enough for her enemies to remove her from power. They had to humiliate her, to tarnish her name so thoroughly that no one would question the legitimacy of what came next. The charges of incest, in particular, were designed to rob Anne of any dignity. Who could pity a woman accused of such horrors? Who could mourn for a queen who had allegedly conspired to destroy the very man who had once adored her? The scandal wasn't just the means of her downfall. It became her legacy, cementing her public image as a dangerous, corrupted figure. In reality, Anne's downfall had far more to do with politics than it did with her personal life. Her inability to produce a male heir, combined with Henry's growing interest in Jane Seymour, made her expendable. Cromwell, recognizing an opportunity to solidify his own power, orchestrated her removal with ruthless efficiency. The trial, filled with lies and fabrications, was merely the final act in a plan that had been set in motion long before Anne ever stepped foot in the Tower. As Anne was led back to her quarters, she must have known there was no escape. Every avenue had been closed, every chance at mercy ignored. The power she had once wielded so brilliantly had been stripped away, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. The Queen, who had defied expectations and reshaped England's history, was now, in the eyes of the court, nothing more than a condemned traitor awaiting execution. But the trial didn't just destroy Anne. It revealed the brutal machinery of Henry's court. It showed how easily a woman's life could be unraveled by ambition, and how little justice mattered when power was at stake. For Anne, the trial wasn't just the end of her time as queen. It was the moment her life became an open question, a story that would echo through history as the ultimate tale of betrayal and tragedy. What awaited Anne after the trial was the sharp finality of the executioner's sword. But even then, she would face her fate with the same resolve that had carried her through the trial. If the courtroom was meant to silence her, it failed. People might remember the accusations, the fabricated confessions, and the cruel verdict. But they would also remember Anne herself, a woman who, even as the world turned against her, refused to be anything less than queenly. Anne Boleyn's story ended on a crisp May morning in 1536. For 17 days, she had been held inside the Tower of London, her world reduced to stone walls and waiting. Imagine knowing with each passing hour that there would be no last-minute pardon, no reversal, no mercy. Everything she had once fought for, her rise to queen, her marriage to Henry, her very survival, had crumbled. And yet, even in this grim chapter, Anne defied expectations. She didn't rage or despair openly. Instead, she faced what was coming with the dignity that had always set her apart, even as it crumbled around her. The announcement was swift. Anne would be executed on May 19th. Her death would not take the gruesome form of burning at the stake, as was allowed by her original sentence. Instead, Henry had chosen a cleaner, quicker method, a beheading by sword carried out by an expert executioner brought from Calais. This unexpected detail has long puzzled historians. Was it an act of kindness? Some whispered that Henry wanted to spare Anne additional suffering, but given his utter indifference by this point, it may have been more about optics. A queen's death, even a disgraced one, required a touch of ceremony. In the days leading to her execution, Anne spent much of her time preparing herself, not only emotionally, but spiritually. Accounts from those around her describe her as composed. Still, one can only imagine what it felt like to see the hours slipping away, knowing their destination. She was said to have remarked at one point on the very nature of her death, her sharp humour still intact. "I hear say the executioner is very good," she noted to her attendants, "and I have a little neck." It's a chilling kind of wit that could only come from someone already standing in the shadow of the end. The morning of May 19th arrived, clear and cool, a day where the weather's beauty seemed at odds with the grim reality of what was about to unfold. Anne was led from her chambers to the scaffold within the tower grounds. The walk was short, but the weight of each step must have felt infinite. She was dressed in a gown of dark grey damask trimmed with fur, her customary style subdued but still regal, as though even now she refused to let them strip her of that final dignity. Her hair, hidden beneath an English gable hood, had been carefully pinned up in preparation for the sword strike. An audience of roughly 1,000 spectators had gathered, courtiers, tower officials, and curious onlookers who understood that they were about to witness the death of a queen. When Anne reached the scaffold, the crowd fell silent. Here was the woman who had once captivated Henry VIII and the English court, standing not as the haughty, ambitious queen many of her detractors painted her to be, but as a startlingly composed figure at the end of her life. Anne addressed the crowd with calm, her voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "I am come hither to die," she said, acknowledging the moment without a trace of self-pity. She went further, speaking words that still echo through history. "I am the king's faithful wife, and owe no malice to any man." There was no blame, no accusation, no dramatic appeal for forgiveness. Anne didn't defend herself. That part of her life was already over. Her words were measured, likely chosen with care. A final act of control in a situation where she had none. The execution itself was over in an instant. The French swordsman, brought in specifically for his precision, performed his task with startling speed. Anne knelt, her small frame bowed low, and her eyes turned heavenward. As she recited a prayer, her executioner moved swiftly, striking once with the sword. No fumbling, no second blow. Death came quickly, almost mercifully, if such a word can even be used here. Her lifeless body was wrapped and carried away, buried in an unmarked grave in St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower grounds. A quiet, shadowy end for someone who had once held the most visible position in England. The aftermath was quiet, but it reverberated in subtle ways. Those watching the execution likely left the tower with their own thoughts about what they had seen. Some may have felt justice had been served, others perhaps uneasy at how casually power could condemn someone so high. History doesn't record the individual reactions of every witness, but it's hard to imagine that something so horrifying could feel comfortable, even in the cruel politics of Tudor England. Anne's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the culmination of a story stained with ambition, love, betrayal, and tragedy. Her execution marked a full-circle tragedy. Ambition had lifted her to unimaginable heights, and ambition had cut her down. For Henry, it was as if she was never more than a solution. First, to his frustrations with Catherine of Aragon, and then to her own perceived failures. Anne's worth had always been measured by what she could give Henry: passion, obedience, a son. When she failed to produce an heir, she became dispensable. Her execution was simply the final brutal move, but her death wasn't the neat conclusion Henry might have imagined. What came next for England would be coloured by Anne's brief, extraordinary life. Her daughter, Elizabeth. the child Anne had once been criticized for bringing into the world instead of a son, would one day rule England as one of its greatest monarchs. And Anne herself, though maligned in her time and destroyed by the rumors surrounding her, would become more than the scandalous queen executed in disgrace. She became a symbol of ambition's cost, yes, but also of resilience. Few figures in history have managed to foment such disaster, yet leave behind such an indelible trace of greatness. As Anne's body lay buried in its anonymous grave, Henry VIII prepared for his future. Less than 2 weeks later, he married Jane Seymour. Life at court moved forward, as it always did, the players shifting but the game remaining the same. Anne's name and reputation were further blackened by her most bitter opponents in the years that followed. Yet, as time passed and history softened the noise of propaganda, the real Anne began to emerge. Her intelligence, her charisma, and her bold refusal to simply exist as another nameless queen all broke through the cracks in history's narrative. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't merely a footnote in Tudor history. It was a moment that revealed the stark, unflinching brutality of Henry's reign. At its heart, it was a story about power, its rise, its grasp, and its relentless need to destroy anything that threatens it. Anne's end was as cruel as it was carefully constructed, but it's a testament to her spirit that her story lingers, not as a cautionary tale, but as a complicated, tragic chapter in the long history of ambition and its price. But there in that courtyard, as the crowd dispersed and the sounds of court life resumed, what remained was silence, a silence that hung heavy over Anne's unmarked grave, a silence that speaks even now. If her life was a lesson, then perhaps her death was too, a final reminder that power, brittle but consuming, remains one of history's greatest tragedies. Anne Boleyn's life wasn't a failure. It was a tragedy scripted by the power games of others, a woman caught in a story she couldn't control. Her only crime was daring to be more than the role others assigned her. What her life and her death forces us to confront isn't just the cost of ambition, but the human toll of a system that demands perfection yet offers none in return. And yet, she leaves behind more than just a place in history. Her legacy isn't in the crown she briefly wore, but in the questions her story still makes us ask.